Hello, it's really nice to see so many people here, and thank you again very much for inviting me. So that's just really a slide so you can see how to spell my name. So this is the plan for the talk. So I'm going to say a little bit about myself so you've got some idea about me, and then I wanted to talk really about what it's like to live with diabetes, or get you to talk a bit about that, and probably say less today, or maybe nothing really, about the sort of rare mental health problems that go along with living with diabetes, and just say much more about the really common psychological implications of living with diabetes, how it affects well-being. So I think it's probably worth letting you know I don't live with diabetes myself. We think when I started my job in Tower Hamlets nearly 5 years ago, that I was the first full-time psychologist for people with diabetes, or adults anyway. There may have been some for children before that. It is my dream job. I've just been lucky enough to have a sort of mini sabbatical, and I've come back with kind of renewed excitement and passion for it. So I did want to spend a little bit of time really finding out from you about these questions really. So what would you say about this? How and why does diabetes affect your well-being? So how you feel, what it's like leading your life. So if you're sort of not feeling that you want to share those things, we can maybe do it by talking to our neighbour, see if anyone's feeling brave. By the way, these bits aren't recorded. If you put your hand up, those bits aren't recorded, so it's really just for everyone else to hear.
My father and his twin brother were diagnosed at the same time with diabetes type 2, and they both love their food, and it's caused a bit of a thing now when we're big family functions, because it sounds ridiculous, but they have to sit there and watch us all tuck in to their things, and it's kind of made my mum think, it's kind of added, I know it sounds funny, but it's actually taken away a bit of, Christmas time, and taken a bit of the fun out of it, and they do get quite down about, not being able to tuck into what everyone else is tucking into, and as you get older, some people really enjoy their foods, and I think it can get quite to them, quite agitated, so anyway.
Yes, thank you.
I know it's not a big...
No, I think it is a big psychological implication. Can anyone else relate to that? So maybe some feelings of deprivation, or that you can't join in, or that you're different to other people suddenly?
Me, I'm living with diabetes.
Yes, thank you.
Over 30 years.
Yeah.
And the older I get, I sort of get more aware of the dangers of this disease.
Yes.
And for me, eating is one of my problems, and I'm trying very hard to eat more healthy and investigating more and more too. And I'm making changes and making changes and making changes, and that can be very frustrating sometimes because you don't know what to eat. I just recently learned that wheat is dangerous, and I was eating wholemeal bread all along. Now I'm trying to stop eating wheat as I hear something, and stop eating this and trying to eat the butter and cutting down on things, and I find it a bit frustrating sometimes, that you can't eat what you would like to eat.
Yes.
I love eating.
Yes, so kind of similar really, feeling that you have to change how you eat and be careful and not have certain foods, so wheat in your case. Yeah. Another lady.
My story is a little bit different. I was diagnosed with gestational diabetes 16 years ago, and the doctor said, it's gestational diabetes, after you've had your baby, you'll be fine, you won't have diabetes anymore. And that almost stuck in my mind. I couldn't get rid of that thought at all. So when my diabetes didn't go, I had it, I continued to have it. For me, I didn't accept I had it at all.
Yeah.
And I carried on thinking I was fine. And even though my levels were in the 20s, it didn't really register to me that I still had diabetes.
Thank you. I think that's a really important point. So that was about kind of how you might get diagnosed with diabetes. So sometimes women have diabetes just when they're pregnant, And sometimes they might be told that this will resolve when you're not pregnant, and for you it didn't. And so that made it a sort of added difficulty, really, accepting the situation and coming to look after yourself. I think acceptance is quite a big one for people with diabetes that I've encountered anyway. Yeah. And gentleman at the front.
I don't actually live with diabetes, but I have a family member who is diabetic, and from my experience, to manage this condition properly is like a full-time job, really.
Yes.
And it's something that you have to live with, from what I've seen, 24 hours a day, really, and you have to plan your food and plan your activity, and I just think that it's a very tough condition to live with.
Yes.
Anyway, they were just my thoughts.
Thank you. That's actually a really helpful thing, because it's what I'm going to talk a little bit about next. But the gentleman was just saying that he lives with somebody with diabetes, and he's aware that it's very much a 24-hour job. It becomes a full-time job trying to look after it well. Would it be okay if we sort of move on to the next bit? We may well get the chance to talk some more in a second. Is there anyone who really feels really hard done by if we move on there? Okay, all right. So I don't apologise, this is a very crowded slide. This is an essentialisation of things that someone living with diabetes has to do on a daily or annual basis. So just to share it with everybody and to share it with the tape, I'm going to read some of this for you. So on a daily basis, people with diabetes are going to be taking quite a lot of tablets. You probably relate to this. You may well be checking what your blood glucose is doing 6 times a day or more, particularly if people are driving. So that's invasive, isn't it? You have to prick your fingers, unpleasant. You may have got to the stage where you're actually trying to monitor exactly what you're eating in terms of carbohydrates and trying to adjust the insulin that you take around that. You may well, in that case, be injecting insulin, which could well be every time you eat something. And other things as well to try and look after your cardiovascular health. So you may be trying to get a grip on your blood pressure, trying to reduce that, trying to reduce your cholesterol levels, looking after your feet, and just doing things that everybody else is meant to be doing as well, like exercising, whatever it is, 6 times a week for 30 minutes, and reducing your stress, trying to eat healthily. And as the disease unfortunately progresses, some people start to lose awareness that their hypoglycemia is when your blood glucose goes very low. So that can literally cause disability, make people unable to drive or leave the house or work normally. And people may develop other health complications that go along with diabetes, which can be quite disabling and also makes it harder to do the job of looking after your health. So you get some support with that if you have diabetes, but not much. Basically, you're on your own with it. So you might see your diabetes specialist certainly once or twice a year. You might choose to see other health professionals more than that. And you get your regular health checks and your retinal screening happening, but only once a year. And people with diabetes are doing all of this, let's not forget, you know for yourself, while having a life. So trying to have a job, trying to look after children, trying to perhaps have relationships and look after elderly parents. Yeah, trying to have normal interests. So I think your point about it being a full-time job is a very good one. So what are the things then that make it pretty hard to cope with diabetes, or as the lady was saying, to try and accept that you have diabetes? So this is kind of the bad news stories, really. There isn't a cure for diabetes as yet. It's a very unpredictable thing to try and look after, and what the formula that worked today for looking after your blood glucose may not work tomorrow or ever again. You can't really escape from it. If you try and have a day off, or someone with type 1 diabetes an hour off, the consequences are pretty severe and pretty immediate. It does get worse even if you look after yourself really well, and in order to look after it, we know you have to pay attention to lots of things at once, and that makes any task difficult. We know that it affects your mood, so your blood glucose changing will affect anyone's mood, but it moves dramatically if you have diabetes. For some people, they've had it since they were a child, which means they had to go through being a teenager with diabetes, which is just exactly when you don't really want to be faffing around looking after your health and having restrictions on what you can eat and drink. Can negatively impact your sex life, so that tends to impact well-being too. And it's very complicated to look after it well, to get it right, as you were saying. And it's rare that other people actually appreciate that or have any understanding of it. So this is just to show you, hopefully it's vaguely visible. In the grey band with the sort of slightly thicker wiggly line, that's where someone without diabetes keeps their blood glucose, and their body just gets on and does that. So the other trace is doing some glucose monitoring for someone with diabetes as they try and keep their blood glucose in that very tight grey band. And you can see what happens. A lot of the time it's very high, or it's a bit above where they'd like it to be, or it's below, which obviously is very unpleasant having low blood glucose. So actually trying to keep your blood glucose in that band is a bit like trying to nail a jelly to a wall. So it's not going to happen, is it? It's actually basically giving yourself an impossible task to do this well all of the time. So that's kind of saying why having diabetes is going to affect your mood and your well-being and your quality of life. So let's go on to the sort of how bit a little bit. So Americans kind of have a word for what can happen to people with diabetes when they've lived with it for a long time, or even at the beginning when it seems very overwhelming, and they call it burnout. So it means it's just exhausting, you've had enough, and sometimes people just kind of stop doing all of the things they know they're meant to be doing because it's too much. Doesn't mean that they stop caring or they stop feeling guilty or bad about that. And sometimes all of those things together end up with some depression, so people actually become depressed on top of everything else. So I'm not sure how visible that is. So it's possibly a GP or a psychiatrist talking to someone with diabetes, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. So they're saying, are you depressed because you have diabetes, or is diabetes causing your depression? And the person just saying yes. Which I think it's probably a good advert for more specialist diabetes psychologists, because we wouldn't really ask a question like that. Yes. The two things are kind of quite inseparable very often, and it doesn't make sense to try and separate it. So you possibly know a bit about depression anyway, but I thought it might just be a good chance to run through this. So how would you know if you were depressed or someone you loved was depressed? So if for longer than 2 weeks these things have been going on, then that might be an indicator that your mood is quite low. So if you've felt so depressed as if you feel low, down, despairing, blank, empty, and if that's happening for most of the time, or particularly acutely in the morning or at the end of the day, that's not a great sign if it's going on for longer than 2 weeks. If you're finding that you're not really interested in things that usually matter to you, that could be relationships, other people, could be things like sex, could be things that are usually pleasurable and enjoyable, that's not a great sign. If you find your weight is changing or your appetite is changing, so this goes in both directions. Sometimes people may get comforty and eat a lot more when they're not feeling so good, or they may just find they stop eating altogether. And it's similar with sleep, so you may find not sleeping or sleeping badly, or just being exhausted and sleeping a lot when you wouldn't ordinarily, so during the day. And going along with that, presumably, is feeling very tired, fatigued, not having energy to do things, not having motivation to do things, finding it harder to concentrate, and some sort of, I would call them more cognitive things, so things that go along with how you feel about yourself, how you feel about the world and other people. So feeling worthless and that it's pointless you carrying on, perhaps feeling that the world would be a better place or that other people wouldn't really care if you weren't there anymore. So it is quite normal to have thoughts about dying or wanting to end your life if you're depressed, but these are good indicators it might be time to seek some help with that. So why is it important to do something about being depressed, particularly if you have diabetes? I think it's probably important to do something about feeling that miserable in general, isn't it? Because that's not great if people carry on feeling that unwell for a long time. And there are very definitely things we can do to help if someone's depressed. So we'll go on to that in a moment. But the combination of depression and diabetes is not so great in terms of health and long-term health outcomes. So unfortunately, if you have a long-term condition of any kind, it's more likely you'll experience depression or low moods in your life. And in the case of diabetes, it's much more likely. So the research estimates vary, but it's something like 2 to 4 times more likely that you would experience depression at some point in your life if you have diabetes. Unfortunately, when people become depressed and they have diabetes, it takes longer to get out of that episode of depression. Depression, sadly, is very often a recurrent illness, so it will come back at different time points, and it will come back more often if you have a long-term condition, especially diabetes. Unfortunately, we don't do so well at spotting that people are depressed, or maybe people don't do so well at kind of knowing that that's what's going on in themselves, who knows. So it gets missed probably in the majority then of people with diabetes. So in your annual health check, particularly if you have type 2 diabetes, this will be something that the nurse or the doctor are looking out for with you. So if you think they're asking slightly odd questions each time, and they probably relate to the ones in the previous checklist, that's what they're up to. So they're trying to check to see how your well-being is. Okay, so this might be of more interest for healthcare professionals in the audience, but for both sorts of diabetes, if you have depression and diabetes, it can mean that people die sooner, that they are more likely to need hospital care, that they will have cardiovascular complications, and they will have all sorts of complications like retinopathy and neuropathy that you've heard about today already, that they're more likely to be quite disabled by living with diabetes and depression. Obviously this is burdensome for the healthcare system, and it's burdensome for the person as well. We talked about the suffering that goes with it. Okay. So I guess my take-home message would be, if you are feeling very fed up with your diabetes, that you just can't go on with this, you need a break, you've had enough, or that you suspect that you might be quite low in mood and depressed, please do talk to someone. And that can be anyone who you trust, that you have a sort of comfortable relationship, you feel won't judge you. That can make just an enormous difference. It might change how you feel quite quickly, but also that person might surprise you in terms of what they might be able to offer with support, with things that might make a difference to how you are. And obviously, I would love for you to talk to somebody who might be able to offer you some help in this situation as well. So increasingly, diabetes teams have access to, particularly in London, to a diabetes psychologist, but they should be able to let you know who you can contact. And it might be that there's something about how your diabetes is going, or that you're finding some new bit of the treatment very difficult to cope with, and they might be able to offer some practical things as well that can quickly make that feel a bit less onerous. And your GP certainly is a very good resource in terms of getting hooked up with some care in the NHS. And sometimes people are worried about taking yet more tablets, so your GP may offer you the option of some antidepressants. It may not be something you're interested in, that's absolutely fine. There is now a lot more talking therapy available in the NHS. That was something the last government invested in heavily. So it should be much quicker for you to access a psychologist or a counsellor through the NHS. So even if they don't specialise in diabetes, you should be able to do that. And if you go and talk to your GP about wanting a referral to a diabetes psychologist, that would be great, because even if they don't have access to one now, it just raises the issue that there should be more of us. So that, I think, was pretty much what I was going to say, yeah. They want to ask, yeah.
Any questions for Dr. Frearson?
Well, you might want to carry on commenting, obviously, as well.
Going back to my poor father,
Yes.
I know he gets very, very stressed and anxious, and you can almost imagine the blood sugar creeping up with the
Yes.
anxiety. Now, being a middle-aged, well, no, maybe he's a bit older than middle-aged now, but to try and get him to actually admit to the doctor that he's feeling low, like there's now causing friction between mum and him, to get a man maybe, this is not being sexist, but to try and get him to go to the doctor with everything else going on, and then to actually say, I'm feeling depressed, is turning out to be quite a hard mission to do. I don't know if there's any way you can, if you're aware, of certain people that maybe aren't very good at knowing good with their emotions.
Yeah. So I'm going to repeat some of that, hopefully fairly accurately for the tape. So it was about your dad again, and
he shows signs of big anxiety.
Yeah.
And when his blood sugar starts going, he gets quite annoyed and sharp.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's dealing with those emotions, and knowing, whether it's his blood sugar and saying, Dad, I think you better, sort of making him realise. But I think we're all coming to aware that there is maybe signs of depression a bit there, and getting him to actually go along to his GP, because he's going for so many appointments that I think he feels a bit stupid for saying, I'm feeling low.
Yes.
From that sort of age group.
Yeah, so firstly, you probably know all this for yourselves anyway, but blood glucose very definitely does affect mood. It can be quite idiosyncratic, which means sometimes it will be having a high blood glucose that makes you feel annoyed and anxious and upset, and sometimes it will be having a low blood glucose that does that, but very definitely does affect mood. This I think is kind of generally, isn't it? It's quite difficult to ask for help just in general if you're in quite a difficult place or you're upset or anxious. I guess the way we handle it in our team is just having me as a normal part of the team and not stressing the mental health professional side of it at all. So particularly people with type 1 diabetes will just encounter me in their doctor's appointments anyway, so it's quite integrated in that way. I guess what I'd suggest in your case maybe is if there is anyone in the diabetes team who he gets on with particularly well, maybe just seeing if you can have a bit more time with them to talk through things, and if you fill them in on what you think's happening, then that might cue them to ask him a little bit more about how he's feeling and see if they can get him to open up.
I just kind of, as well, being a health professional, it's made me aware that there might be quite a few people you see that seem to be doing quite well, but underneath might not be, and for them it's quite, they might appear to be doing lots of great stuff, but underneath there might be other things going on, and it's just to be aware, not to miss those people and to find ways of allowing them to open up when they're with you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
How are we doing on the timing?
We've got one.
Okay.
Thank you. Just a quick comment, I think, and one of the factors that does, I think, or could make people depressed about their diabetes is funding, because some of the treatments are not available free, and therefore, if people don't have the funding available, they're unable to take advantage of it.
So the gentleman was just commenting that it can be. Sorry? Oh gosh, that shouldn't be an issue any longer. We can talk about that after. So sometimes if you feel you're being denied treatment for funding reasons, that can be a source of frustration and depression as well for people. You're just commenting that.
There's a question there from one of our colleagues.
We've got a microphone for him.
Hello. Do you routinely hold sessions with carers to recognise diabetes burnout? I ask this because my mother, I have every reason to believe that she suffered from that and she died. And none of us were equipped or taught to recognise that.
We don't really, which might, repeating the question, was whether we help carers really skill up to look out for things like diabetes, burnout and low mood. We don't really, which might be just the sort of slant that the health service has in this country. So we often come from the perspective of the person living with the condition themselves and think less about all their sort of social system around them, and that it's not just their diabetes, it's shared with the rest of the family and all their other loved ones as well. I don't, unless people invite their carers into the room with them, I don't necessarily have contact with families and supporters that much. Yeah.
Thank you. I think on that note, we're going to close the question and answer session.
I'm going to be around in the lunch break if people are feeling that they want to talk about something individually.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frearson.